Before I begin this next installment in my Genealogy of Wokeness series, I want to respond to some misunderstandings of what I am arguing. There have been some woke people who claim that I am just proving my ignorance of those I disagree with, something I have criticized progressives for, since they are neither explicitly religious, in response to my claim that they are secularized Puritan crypto-religion, nor directly influenced by Rousseau, in response to my first genealogy video. Another commenter who agreed with my overall distaste for wokeness similarly expressed confusion over my selection of Rousseau, rather than someone closer to our time that leftists explicitly cite as influences. These criticisms simply show a misunderstanding of what I'm setting out to do in this series. I'm not presenting a bibliography of the most explicit and direct influences on modern leftist thought. Instead, what I am doing is presenting a genealogy of ideas, as they've been passed down throughout the last few centuries of Western history, that contributed over time to the basic presuppositions that modern people now take for granted. If you think about it like a family tree, I am not covering the father and mother of wokeness, but rather its great-great-great-grandparents. And in doing so, I am also demonstrating that modern conservatism as well is part of this family of ideas, being actually a sibling of wokeness. What I want to highlight with all of this is the fact that wokeness is not the root, but rather merely a symptom of much greater and more foundational deviations from the Western tradition that manifest themselves all across the spectrum of modern thought. Only by undoing this long line of gradual deviations from the rational foundation of traditional values and culture can we escape the liberal hellscape we found ourselves in. That being said, I will now turn to my next subject in this series, William of Ockham. Ockham was a pioneer of nominalism, a philosophical position that can really only be understood in light of its preceding philosophical context. Nominalism arose as a reaction to the problem of universals. In the Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics that had previously prevailed in the West, it was believed that universals had a real existence outside of the mind. So, for instance, not only do individual humans have a real existence as individuals, but they also possess a universal nature called humanity, which also has a real existence. And this is the case for all things with similarities. Not only do individual cats exist, but so does the universal of catness. Not only do individual recliners and rocking chairs exist, but so does the universal of chairness. Not only do individual men and women exist, but so do the universals of maleness and femaleness, and so on. Now, Plato and Aristotle, and those who followed after them, presented different modes of existence for these universals, believing them to exist either in ideal forms in a separate realm of forms or simply in the individual things themselves respectively. But despite their different ways of explaining it, they at least agreed that universals have a real existence apart from human thought. It was in reaction to this metaphysical realism that the nominalism of philosophers like William of Ockham developed. Nominalism is the idea that universals have no real existence outside of rational minds, but that they are simply useful names, thus the title nominalism, which our minds ascribe to similarities between individual things. As Ockham writes, a universal is not something real that exists in a subject. It has a being only as a thought object in the mind. So, for instance, while catness is a helpful word to help our minds examine the similarities between individual cats, all that has a real existence outside of our minds are the individual cats. There is thus no such thing as a common humanity which Plato, William of Ockham, and Miley Cyrus all possess. Humanity exists only in our brains as we rationally categorize sets of individual humans. The problem with this idea is that it ultimately transfers meaning, especially regarding language, from the realm of objective external reality to arbitrary internal usefulness. What I mean by this is that when we use language, according to nominalism, our words no longer directly correspond to an objective reality outside of ourselves. Instead, we are arbitrarily assigning a name to something which does not truthfully correspond to it in any way. While Ockham would certainly like to say that this is not quite arbitrary, the logical implication of universals having no existence at all in individual things themselves is that there no longer exists anything in an individual thing which corresponds to the name which our minds assign to it. If realism is not true, then the names by which we refer to universals must be arbitrary and purely pragmatic. Thus, the definitions of words, especially as they describe sets of individual things, are malleable and can be changed according to whatever useful purpose they can serve. It is not difficult to see how this idea opens the floodgates for the manipulation of words that finds the pinnacle of its expression in Orwellian doublespeak. If the definition of a word is really just determined by what useful purpose it serves, then there is nothing preventing a totalitarian regime from changing the dictionary to support a political agenda. And this war over the dictionary is precisely what we see in modern political discourse. Because the word love is not believed to have a real existence except as a useful term in our minds, its definition can be changed from that which conforms to the law of God, as far as it defines proper affections for and treatment of others, to any kind of warm, fuzzy feeling, especially of a perverse sexual nature. And because the universal concept of femaleness is not believed to have a real existence, no one can definitively answer the question, what is a woman? And thus men with long hair are winning Woman of the Year, and absolutely destroying biological females in women's sporting events. We also saw the definition of recession swiftly recently changed in order to support the president's claim that our recession is not indeed a recession. Since we believe that universals are names only and not real things, we can thus simply change the dictionary whenever certain facts of reality stand in the way of our political agenda. Another way in which this expresses itself is in the inability of modern man to see the importance of symbolism, ritual, formality, and religion. The foundation of each of these things is a direct correspondence of signs and symbols to the thing which they signify. As with the breakdown of language which occurs by relativizing what words symbolize, so also all symbolic understandings of reality have broken down in modern society due to nominalism. All pre-modern societies understood everything in the world to carry inherent symbolic meaning that established a connection to the fundamental meaning of the world and to higher realms of existence. The Bible, for instance, talks a ton about trees. Its authors understand trees not merely as one of many natural objects that evolved for purely utilitarian ends, but instead as symbols created by God to communicate meaning. They are used as metaphors for thriving human beings whose lives are firmly rooted in the law of God, and even as images of the glory of God himself, who provides shade and life-giving fruit as sustenance for his people. And so through the observation of truths about trees, we can deduce not only truths about trees themselves, but also about fundamental aspects of reality. Because pre-modern man understood the objectivity of the symbolism of all natural objects, they could come to knowledge of abstract, spiritual, and universal truths through the observation of the natural world. And these truths were then communicated by men to one another through symbolism in art, architecture, ritual, and clothing. They were not blind to God's constant communication to humanity through the natural world, because they believed that symbolism existed in the things themselves, rather than being a mere mental framework projected by our minds onto the things we observed. But nominalism breaks down this connection between signs and things signified by those signs, so that we become blinded to the universal realities communicated in all individual objects. This paved the way for later movements in thought, such as the radical empiricism of David Hume. This empiricist skepticism expresses even agnosticism concerning natural laws, such as cause and effect, since all that our senses perceive are the appearance of cause and effect and not the process itself. Thus, for instance, when playing a game of pool, all that our senses actually witness are one ball hitting the others and the others moving thereafter. Whether the first pool ball hitting the others is actually the cause of the movement of the others is only something we infer from what we perceived, not actually the thing we perceived. Therefore, we only know with certainty what we perceive with our senses, rather than what we might infer from such perceptions. With this radical breakdown of the connection between signs and things signified, modern man has moved toward a complete utilitarianism in all that it produces. We have come to prefer merely functional architecture, rather than the cathedrals and palaces of past cultures which drew the minds of their beholders to a realm of higher meaning and beauty. We have come to regard our politicians as merely functional managers, to pragmatically order society toward material ends, rather than representatives of God's higher law and order. And this is seen in the radical change in dress, from the glorious robes and crowns of kings, to the pragmatic businessman aesthetic of the suit and tie of the American president. Our preference in ways of speaking as well has gotten rid of all flourishes in style, formality, politeness of manners, and richness of symbolism in favor of blunt, casual, direct, overly efficient, and even profane language. In terms of our political thinking, nominalism also underlies the trend toward hyper-individualism. Because there is no such thing as humanity, but only individual humans, it only makes sense under this model to give individuals top priority in the aims of our laws. If the city, or the nation, only exist as mental concepts we apply to sets of individuals, then the highest good of the city or nation becomes equated with the highest good of each individual. Therefore, we get the libertarian approach to ethics, in which all actions must be permissible as long as no other individuals are being harmed. It does not matter if the actions are detrimental to society as a whole, since societies themselves have no real existence. Thus, even though the rise of sodomy and transgenderism contributes to the breakdown of the family, goes against the natural law of reproduction in its inability to produce offspring, and brings about the judgment of God on whole communities, governments are to be concerned only with the highest good, as defined by each individual, and therefore must permit such actions. So to counteract the decadence of contemporary Western society, it will not do to simply combat the most blatantly wrong symptoms of child sex changes and affirmative action. We have to go back and correct the places where we first began to head in this direction. We need to go back all the way to Ockham and reject his divorce of universals from reality. We need to begin to see with new eyes, though really quite ancient ones, the inherent meaning that is baked into all individual objects, which draws our minds to higher truths, which our senses cannot directly perceive. Only then can we begin to once again treat morality as objective, gender as a fixed reality and not a societal construct, beauty as true, rhetoric as an art, architecture as inhabitable spaces of meaning, and the good of society as something greater than the preferences of each individual. Only when we begin to not only see things, but to see through things to the realities which stand behind them, can we once again see God's fingerprint in all things and return as a society to the reality He created by His eternal, ever-true Word. For more on the impact of nominalism, the importance of metaphysical realism, and the inherent symbolism of the world, I'd highly recommend the books Ideas Have Consequences by Richard M. Weaver, After Virtue by Alastair MacIntyre, and Through New Eyes by James B. Jordan, respectively. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe and all that.